Welcome to Subthesis. Before we dive in, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new tutorial on systematic reviews and research methodology. You can also visit our website at www.subthesis.com for additional tools, guides, downloadable templates, and resources that will help you with every step of your research journey. If you find this video helpful, please share it with your colleagues and fellow researchers. Every like and share helps us reach more people who need this information. We are building a community of researchers who support each other, and your engagement makes a real difference. Now, let us get started with today's very important topic. Welcome to this comprehensive guide on risk of bias assessment using the Cochrane Risk of Bias 2 framework. This is one of the most important skills you need to develop as a systematic review author. Whether you are new to systematic reviews or you have been doing them for years, understanding how to properly assess risk of bias is absolutely critical to the credibility of your work. In this presentation, we are going to walk through everything you need to know, from the basic concepts all the way to practical tips for making consistent and reliable judgments across studies. By the end of this session, you will have a solid foundation for conducting rigorous risk of bias assessments in your own systematic reviews. So grab a notebook, get comfortable, and let us dive right in. Here is what we are going to cover today. First, we will establish why risk of bias assessment is absolutely non-negotiable if you want your systematic review to be taken seriously by journals, peer reviewers, and the research community. This is not optional work, it is a core requirement. Second, we will go through all 5 domains of the Risk of Bias 2 tool in detail. These 5 domains cover every major source of bias that can affect the results of a randomized controlled trial. Third, we will talk about how each domain requires specific judgment criteria and supporting evidence. You cannot just guess your way through this. You need to follow a structured process. Fourth, and this is really important, we will discuss how your bias judgments directly affect the conclusions you can draw from your review. The stakes are high because clinical decisions depend on the quality of evidence you produce. And finally, we will point you toward practical resources and tools that will help you practice and get better at this skill over time. There is a lot to cover, so let us get right into it. So let us start with the basics. What exactly is risk of bias? Risk of bias refers to systematic errors in the design, conduct, or analysis of a study that can lead to incorrect estimates of the treatment effect. Notice I said systematic errors, not random errors. Random errors affect the precision of your estimate, meaning your confidence interval gets wider. But systematic errors affect accuracy. They push the results in one direction, either overestimating or underestimating the true effect of the intervention. Now, here is a very important distinction that many people get wrong. Risk of bias assessment is not the same as judging study quality. Study quality is a vague and subjective concept that has been largely abandoned in modern evidence synthesis. When someone says a study is low quality, what do they actually mean? It could mean 100 different things. Risk of bias, on the other hand, is a structured and focused assessment of specific features of the study that could introduce bias into a particular result. The Cochrane Risk of Bias 2 tool, which replaced the original tool back in 2019, provides a standardized framework for making these assessments. It brought much needed improvements in clarity, structure, and reproducibility. Let us take a moment to understand why the Risk of Bias 2 tool was developed in the first place. The original Risk of Bias tool had several well-documented limitations that became apparent over years of use. On the left side of this slide, you can see the main problems. The domain-level assessments were vague and left too much room for interpretation. Different review teams interpreted them very differently, which led to inconsistent application across reviews. There were no structured signaling questions to guide assessors through a logical decision process, and there was no clear algorithm for reaching an overall judgment. This meant that two experienced reviewers could look at the exact same study and reach completely different conclusions about its risk of bias. On the right side, you can see how Risk of Bias 2 addressed every one of these issues. It introduced a fixed set of signaling questions for each domain, so every assessor follows the same logical path. It provides clear algorithms that map answers to domain-level judgments. And most importantly, it shifted the focus from study-level assessment to result-level assessment. You are no longer asking whether the entire study is biased. Instead, you are asking whether a specific result from that study is likely to be biased. This is a fundamentally more useful question for systematic reviews. Now let us talk about why bias assessment is absolutely non-negotiable. I cannot stress this enough. If you skip risk of bias assessment or do it poorly, your entire systematic review loses credibility. First, it is required by every major reporting guideline. Cochrane requires it. The Preferred Reporting Items for Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analyses 2020 statement requires it. There is no way around this. Second, without a proper assessment, your review simply lacks scientific credibility. Peer reviewers will reject your manuscript. Editors will send it back. Third, and this is the clinical reality, biased studies can inflate or deflate treatment effects by 20 to 40%. Think about what that means. A drug that appears to work might actually be no better than a placebo, or a treatment that seems harmful might actually be beneficial. Fourth, clinical decisions based on biased evidence can directly cause patient harm. Doctors use systematic reviews to decide how to treat their patients. If your review is based on biased evidence and you did not account for that, you could be contributing to incorrect treatment decisions. And fifth, funders, journals, and guideline panels all expect rigorous bias assessment. If you want your work to inform clinical practice, you must get this right. This slide highlights the connection between Risk of Bias 2 and the Grading of Recommendations, Assessment, Development, and Evaluations framework, which is the leading approach for assessing the certainty of evidence in health research. Risk of bias is one of 5 domains used to assess certainty of evidence. The other 4 are inconsistency, indirectness, imprecision, and publication bias. But risk of bias is often the most influential because it directly questions whether the underlying results are trustworthy. When studies have high risk of bias, the certainty of evidence gets downgraded. High certainty evidence can drop to moderate, low, or even very low. This has enormous practical consequences. A strong recommendation based on high certainty evidence becomes a conditional recommendation when certainty drops. Clinicians treat conditional recommendations very differently. The framework requires assessments at the outcome level, not the study level. This aligns perfectly with how Risk of Bias 2 operates, since it assesses bias for a specific result. This alignment makes Risk of Bias 2 the ideal companion tool for certainty of evidence assessments. Now we arrive at the heart of this presentation, the 5 Risk of Bias 2 domains. Each of these 5 domains addresses a different source of bias that can affect the results of a randomized controlled trial. Domain 1 focuses on the randomization process. Domain 2 examines deviations from intended interventions. Domain 3 looks at missing outcome data. Domain 4 evaluates the measurement of the outcome. Domain 5 assesses selection of the reported result. Together, they provide comprehensive coverage of all major ways bias can creep into study results. In the next several slides, we will go through each domain in detail. Pay close attention to the specific signaling questions because they form the backbone of your assessment. Let us start with Domain 1, the randomization process. Was the allocation of participants truly random? Proper randomization is the foundation of a randomized controlled trial. The signaling questions ask 3 things. First, was the sequence generated using a random method? This means computer-generated numbers or random number tables, not alternation or date of birth, which are predictable. Second, was the allocation concealed until the moment of assignment? Even a random sequence can be undermined if someone can see the next assignment. Look for central telephone randomization or sealed opaque envelopes. Third, did baseline differences suggest randomization was compromised? Large imbalances in key prognostic factors are a red flag, even with proper methods. Domain 2 evaluates deviations from the intended interventions. Did participants and personnel follow the study protocol? Participants might stop taking medication, switch groups, or receive additional treatments. The signaling questions are important because this domain has 2 sub-analyses. Were participants aware of their assigned intervention? In an open-label trial, knowledge can influence behavior. Were there deviations due to the trial context? Were deviations balanced between groups? And did deviations actually affect the outcome? Not all deviations matter. A participant who missed 1 dose of a 6-month treatment was probably not significantly affected. This is an important distinction within Domain 2. When you assess it, you must decide whether you are interested in the effect of assignment or the effect of adhering to the intervention. The effect of assignment, also called the intention to treat effect, estimates the effect of being assigned to an intervention regardless of adherence. This reflects real-world policy decisions and is less susceptible to bias. The effect of adhering estimates what would happen if everyone actually followed the protocol. This is more susceptible to confounding because people who adhere are systematically different from those who do not. Estimating this properly requires sophisticated statistical methods. You must choose which effect you are assessing before starting Risk of Bias 2 for Domain 2. Domain 3 addresses missing outcome data. Participants drop out for many reasons. They move away, experience side effects, get better and feel they no longer need treatment, or simply lose interest. The question is whether the missing data could have biased the results. Were data available for nearly all participants? If 95% or more have complete data, it is usually fine. Is there evidence the result was not biased by missing data? Could missingness depend on the true outcome value? If participants with worse outcomes were more likely to drop out of the treatment group, the remaining data would make treatment look better than it actually is. This is called informative missingness, and it is a major bias source. Was an appropriate analysis used? The pattern of missingness matters more than the raw percentage, but more than 5% missing data generally warrants closer examination. Domain 4 evaluates outcome measurement, and this is where blinding becomes critical. Was the measurement method appropriate and reliable? Could measurement differ between groups due to different follow-up intensity? Were outcome assessors aware of which intervention participants received? Could knowledge of the intervention influence assessment? This depends on the outcome type. Objective outcomes like death or laboratory values are unlikely to be affected by assessor blinding, but subjective outcomes like pain scores or quality of life are highly susceptible to bias when assessors are unblinded. Blinded outcome assessment is a powerful protection. When you see a study with blinded assessment for a subjective outcome, that is a very good sign. Domain 5 assesses selection of the reported result. The concern is that investigators might have selected which result to report based on what looked favorable. Was the trial analyzed per a pre-specified plan? If a published protocol or trial registration specifies the primary outcome, the statistical method, and the time point, you can compare planned with reported. Is the result likely selected from multiple outcome measurements? For example, reporting only the pain scale that showed a bigger effect. Is it selected from multiple analyses, like choosing between adjusted and unadjusted models? Pre-registration on platforms like clinicaltrials.gov gives you a benchmark. Discrepancies between the protocol and the publication are a red flag for selective reporting. Now let us talk about the 3 judgment categories. Low risk of bias, shown in green with a plus sign, means the study adequately protects against bias in this domain. Some concerns, shown in amber with an exclamation mark, means possible concerns that are not serious enough for high risk. This is the most common judgment in practice because most studies have some ambiguity in their reporting. High risk of bias, shown in red with a minus sign, means a serious problem likely introduced meaningful bias. Each judgment must be supported by clear rationale based on the signaling questions and evidence from the study report. Never make a judgment without documenting your reasoning. This slide explains how you reach an overall risk of bias judgment after assessing all 5 domains. The rules are straightforward. A result has low overall risk only if it receives low risk in all 5 domains. Every single domain must be green. A result has some concerns overall if there are some concerns in at least one domain, but no domain is high risk. This is the most common overall judgment because achieving all green is quite rare. A result has high overall risk if any single domain is high risk. Additionally, some concerns in multiple domains can push the overall to high risk if they collectively lower confidence substantially. Always consider the direction of potential bias. If all biases point the same direction, their combined effect is more concerning than if they cancel each other out. Document the primary reasons for your overall judgment clearly for transparency. How do you make consistent and reliable judgments across different studies? Consistency is absolutely essential because unreproducible judgments are essentially meaningless. First, always use the signaling questions. Never skip directly to a judgment. They force you to consider specific aspects rather than forming a vague impression. Second, follow the algorithm. It maps signaling question answers to domain judgments. Do not override it based on gut feeling. Third, use at least 2 independent reviewers for each assessment. Each should assess independently before comparing results. Fourth, when disagreements occur, discuss them openly and involve a 3rd reviewer if consensus cannot be reached. The goal is not forced agreement, but well-reasoned judgments. Fifth, document your reasoning in the support text field for every judgment. This documentation ensures transparency and allows others to verify and reproduce your work. The signaling questions are the engine that drives the entire Risk of Bias 2 assessment. Each domain contains between 3 and 7 signaling questions answered in a specific order. Possible answers are yes, probably no, probably no, and no information. An important point is that probably answers carry the same weight as definitive answers in the algorithm. Probably yes is treated the same as yes. This is deliberate because you rarely have perfect information. Be careful about overusing no information. It typically leads to some concerns and sometimes triggers high risk. Before defaulting to it, check the protocol, trial registration, supplementary materials, and consider contacting the study authors. For every signaling question, you must provide supporting text that explains and justifies your answer with specific references to the study report. This is not optional. This traffic light table is the standard way to present risk of bias results in a systematic review. You will see it in almost every Cochrane review. Each row is a study, each column is a domain. Green plus means low risk. Amber exclamation means some concerns. Red minus means high risk. The final column shows the overall judgment. Looking at this example, Chen 2019 has all green, so low overall. This is the ideal, but unfortunately uncommon scenario. Smith 2020 has mostly green, but some concerns for domain 3, missing outcome data, making the overall some concerns. Jones 2021 has high risk for domain 2, deviations from interventions, which automatically makes the overall high risk. Davis 2022 has concerns across multiple domains, collectively resulting in high risk. The visualization tool called RoB can generate these traffic light plots automatically from your data, producing publication-ready figures in seconds. Now the critical question. How do your risk of bias judgments actually affect the conclusions of your systematic review? The most common approach is sensitivity analysis. Run your meta-analysis with all studies included. Then run it again, excluding high-risk studies. If results change substantially, the bias studies were driving the overall effect, and your conclusions are less robust. If results stay similar, that gives you more confidence. You should also consider subgroup analysis comparing treatment effects from low-risk versus high-risk studies. If the effect is larger in high-risk studies, bias is likely inflating the apparent effect. For evidence certainty assessment, high risk of bias is one of the main reasons to downgrade certainty. Your summary of findings table must explain how bias influenced your assessment. And transparency is paramount. Readers need to see which studies drive the conclusions. A forest plot annotated with risk of bias judgments is excellent for this. Let us go deeper into specific analytical methods. Sensitivity analysis is the simplest. Exclude high-risk studies and compare results. If the pooled estimate changes substantially or statistical significance shifts, biased studies are driving findings. Always report these results even if nothing changes. Subgroup analysis creates two groups based on overall risk of bias and tests whether the treatment effect differs between them. A formal test for subgroup differences is informative here. Meta-regression is the most sophisticated approach. You include risk of bias as a covariate and test whether it predicts effect size. This is useful when you have many studies. For presentation, create forest plots with colored symbols indicating each study's risk of bias judgment. readers can immediately see whether the largest effects come from the most biased studies. If only high-risk studies remain in your evidence base, interpret findings with extreme caution and communicate that clearly. Let us talk about common mistakes. First, confusing study quality with risk of bias. They are not the same. A well-funded study can still produce biased results if implementation had problems. Second, assessing at the study level instead of the result level. The same study might have low risk for one outcome and high risk for another. Third, skipping signaling questions and jumping to judgments based on overall impression. This defeats the purpose of structured assessment. Fourth, using no information as a default without checking protocols, registrations, and supplementary files. Always exhaust all avenues before choosing no information. Fifth, failing to document supporting text. Without documentation, your judgments are opaque and cannot be verified or reproduced. Learning from these mistakes will save you significant time and make your assessments much more reliable. Follow this 6-step workflow for every study. Step 1. Read the full text carefully, including supplementary materials and the trial registration. Do not try to assess from the abstract alone. Step 2. Identify the specific result you are assessing, the outcome, the time point, and the effect of interest. Remember, risk of bias 2 operates at the result level. Step 3. Work through signaling questions for each domain in order, documenting your rationale as you go. Step 4. Apply the algorithm to determine each domain judgment. Step 5. Record your judgment and rationale with specific references to the study report. Step 6. Reach the overall judgment by combining all 5 domain judgments according to the rules we discussed. Each independent reviewer follows this entire process before coming together to compare and reconcile assessments. Let me point you toward excellent resources. First, the official Risk of Bias 2 tool at riskofbias.info has everything you need: the tool itself, the detailed guidance document, templates, and frequently asked questions. Second, RoB is a free visualization tool that creates traffic light plots from your data. Simply enter your judgments and it generates publication-ready figures. Third, RevMan Web has Risk of Bias 2 built in for Cochrane reviews. Fourth, the guidance document provides detailed instructions with worked examples for each domain, essential reading for first-time users. Fifth, the Cochrane Training YouTube channel has step-by-step video tutorials. And finally, practice is the best way to improve. Take 3 to 5 published randomized controlled trials, have your team assess them independently, then compare and calibrate your judgments. This calibration exercise is invaluable for achieving consistency. Let's wrap up with 6 key takeaways. First, risk of bias assessment is essential, not optional. Every credible systematic review requires it. Second, Risk of Bias 2 provides a structured and reproducible framework that is now the standard tool recommended by Cochrane. Third, the 5 domains, randomization, deviations from interventions, missing outcome data, measurement of the outcome, and selection of the reported result, systematically cover all major sources of bias in randomized trials. Fourth, always use signaling questions and document your rationale. Never skip them. Fifth, your bias judgments feed directly into your certainty of evidence assessment and determine the strength of your conclusions. And sixth, Practice and calibration are the keys to becoming a reliable assessor. The more studies you assess with experienced colleagues, the better you will get. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial on risk of bias assessment using the Cochrane Risk of Bias 2 framework. I really hope you found this helpful. If you have any questions at all, please leave them in the comments below and I will do my best to answer. If this video helped you, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us create more content like this for the research community. And do not forget to visit subthesis.com for additional tools, guides, and resources on systematic reviews and research methodology. We have downloadable templates, step-by-step tutorials, and much more waiting for you there. Thank you again for your time, and good luck with your systematic reviews. I will see you in the next video.